What you have to look at from an edge perspective is how secure is the design of the software service that I'm running in the edge location. And that's, again, something that a lot of organizations with more traditional mindsets around security aren't going to fully understand or appreciate. What are the subtleties? What are the specific risks around the design of the software stack there?
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Eric Walenza, CEO of IoT One, your analyst for tracking and understanding enterprise technology trends. Our guest today is Jeremy Snyder, founder and CEO of FireTail.io and host of the Modern Cyber podcast. FireTail.io provides end-to-end API security to prevent breaches and protect applications and IoT devices from code to cloud. In this talk, we explored how enterprise connections have changed in the last 5 years, how they will change in the coming years, and the implications for cybersecurity. We discussed the impact of AI on cybercrime as the cost of launching an attack moves towards zero. We compared security approaches for on-premise, cloud, and IoT devices. And we explored trends in hacking and phishing and in the different security requirements for defending against cyber criminals and corporate or state espionage. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, you can email us at team@iot1.com. Finally, if you have a technology, research, or strategy initiative that you'd like to discuss, please email me directly at erik.walenza@iot1.com. Thank you.
Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today, with your host, Eric Walenza.
Jeremy, you're very experienced. So you're running the Modern Cyber podcast as well with a focus on CISOs. Tell me a little bit about that podcast.
We do focus on CISOs, but we actually talk to a lot of practitioners as well. We try to cover a very broad range of cybersecurity topics, and that's kind of by design. Cybersecurity is a super broad topic. Everything from antivirus to phishing to spam detection and prevention and making sure you eliminate bad links, up to things like identity in the cloud and API security and security for AI. So there's so much happening in the space of cybersecurity that we really try to talk to a very broad range of people, get a little bit of everything, a little bit of the C-level, a little bit of the day-to-day practitioner, a little bit of the on-premise, a little bit of the cloud, and really, something for everybody who's interested in the space of cybersecurity. And we've been running it for coming up on a year, and it's been a ton of fun. And I think actually one of the things I would say out of it, I've learned a ton. So whether our audience learns as much is hard for me to say, but I've learned a ton and I've really enjoyed the experience.
Yeah, that's always how I think about my podcast as well, is that for me, this is my ongoing education. And as long as I get something out of each hour, at least I know that it's made one customer happy and hopefully some other listeners as well. So you are in a boom industry, right? Protecting the world from cybercrime. And really a topic where 20 years ago, 10% of companies would be thinking really seriously about this, like the IT department's kind of doing it.
Yeah.
And now because of IoT, kind of bringing connectivity to the edge, because of AI, maybe influencing the cost structure of cybercrime, everybody has to take this quite seriously across the organization. I want to get into the topic of what has changed, and then maybe also what will be changing in the next 5 to 10 years. But before we go into that, tell us a bit about what you're doing at FireTail. And so you're doing end-to-end API security. I think maybe the critical question is also why focus on the API? But what are you guys doing? What's your proposition?
Yeah, I mean, end-to-end API security is what it's all about. But what does that actually mean? That, look, APIs are this kind of mythical thing that a lot of people hear about, but they don't really understand what they do. The simplest way to think about it is that APIs are the way that two pieces of software or two systems talk to each other. Every time you pull up your mobile device and you use any app on there, it's actually talking to another service at the back end over an API. Every time there are two IoT systems talking to each other, they're using an API to communicate with each other. So they're this kind of connective tissue of the modern internet that really ties all of these services together. So that's the starting. But what does that mean from a security perspective? Like, what are the risks and what is end to end mean? Well, the risks are that APIs get abused like any other system that is kind of designed to be open. And APIs have to be open in order to communicate with other systems, right? So that's kind of an inherent entry point that attackers and threat actors look at. When we started analyzing APIs in more detail, we understand that they're kind of this funny object, right? They're part of an application, so they're written in code. So developers build them, but then they live on a network and they're sending network traffic out. But they also have identity because you have to authenticate in order to use an API and then authorize yourself to use it and so on. So they've got all these constructs around it. So what we looked at from the FireTail perspective is we said, okay, well, if that's what APIs are, where on that journey, where in the life cycle of an API can we help companies make them more secure? And what we figured out from our perspective is that there's a security inspection that can be done all the way at the design and development phase that uses techniques like static code analysis and spec inspection and things like that. And I know some of those terms might be a little bit techie for some people listening, but you could think about it like this. You can look at an API as it's being built and make sure that the design of the API is secure by design. So that's one aspect of what we do. But then you can swing all the way over to the other side and just look at what's happening with the API while it's out in the real world in production. And that's kind of, traffic monitoring and an analysis. We do that as well. We look for anomalies. We can also look for specific malicious traffic patterns in the utilization. And so that's what we're doing at FireTail. It's all software driven. It is a software platform that combines elements of AI in our own utilization, in our own data analysis, but it also does some things where we have code libraries that can help developers build and launch secure APIs. So that's what we're doing. We've been at it for a couple of years now. We're working with a number of companies around the world in spaces like IoT, financial services. Honestly, a lot of modern software is being written with APIs first and foremost. And so we're working with companies like that as well. And yeah, that's a little bit about us.
So that must mean that your customers are developers, that your customers are not the operators or the users of the technology.
So we really have two parts of the product, and one is designed for the developer and one is designed for the operator and the info security team. I mentioned kind of the monitoring what's happening in the real world in production. That is very much designed for a security team. On that side, when organizations come to us and they say, hey, we're looking to tackle our API security, that is one of the first questions. We figure out what's your role within the organization, kind of which side of the house do you sit on. If you're on the security side, we're going to talk to you about the traffic analysis, about the API discovery functions, et cetera. If you're a developer, we're going to talk to you about the code libraries and secure by design and how we can help you down that journey. And by the way, we try in the software to really enable communication between those two teams, which often is actually an organizational challenge more than it is a technical challenge, is getting those two groups to talk to each other and to understand what the other side is seeing.
Yeah, interesting. And then from the operations side, I guess they'll look at it and they'll say, well, I'm already deploying 3 cybersecurity solutions. I've got my gateways covered and I'm using anomaly detection. Why do I need a fourth? So why don't those existing systems cover APIs sufficiently?
Yeah, that is because the nature of the API threat is fundamentally different. And we've actually done research on this for the last, since we've come into existence as a company, right? 2.5 years ago or whatever it is at this point. We've actually been tracking all the API breaches over time. And you can find that research on our website. If you just look in the footer of our website, you'll find an API data breach tracker. You'll find our state of API security report. And when we analyzed all of the breach events, one by one, you can look through them and you can see, oh, okay, well, this is how the threat actor abused this API. Yep. And here's why anomaly detection didn't catch it. And here's why the gateway didn't catch it. And here's why the web application firewall didn't catch it. And it really comes down to the fact that the number one cause of API abuse is lack of proper authorization controls. So authorization is not the same as authentication. Authentication means I establish that you are Eric. Authorization means that I know what data Eric has access to and what Eric can do with that data. And what you can do is often also as important as the data you have access to. So think about it like this. Maybe there is a social media app and Eric can view Eric's profile. Eric can edit Eric's profile. Eric can view Jeremy's profile, but Eric cannot edit Jeremy's profile. And what we see in the case of APIs again and again is that that level, that fine-grained permissions checking is not there. And so it allows bad actors to actually register themselves on these platforms, get access to the API, and then extract and manipulate large quantities of data by exploiting that permissions gap.
Gotcha. Okay, great. So, yeah, just wanted to cover those points and make sure I understood the business properly. But you were just getting into what has changed over, let's say, the past 5 years in terms of enterprise connectivity.
Well, past 5 years has been a really interesting time, right? Because the past 5 years we're getting into right before COVID and then kind of going through the COVID transformation. I'll back up a little bit first and I'll talk about kind of what I've observed in my 27-ish years or whatever it is at this point. Look, when I started, to the point you raised earlier, 10% of companies were worried about cybersecurity. Everybody else, security was just part of what the IT team did, right? And that included myself and the companies that I was at the time. Well, what's changed kind of at a macro level over time is that cloud has come into being, open source has grown like crazy, and automation has grown like crazy. And what that means is that, instead of 20 years ago, where only those top 10% of organizations would have been targeted, nowadays everybody's a target. It costs pennies to set up a virtual machine on a cloud platform, load some open source penetration testing and scanning software, and then just start scanning the internet or scanning any particular IP range. And so now everybody's a target. And I always tell people, hackers have automation too. Hackers have credit cards or they have stolen money and they have access to the cloud. They can set this stuff up. And we see this in our own labs. Anything we put online is scanned within about 5 minutes. So you asked me about kind of what's changed 5 years to now. 5 years ago, I was working on cloud security and we saw the same thing, but maybe the delay time was 10 to 15 minutes. Nowadays, anything new we put online, it's within 5 minutes, it's getting scanned. Not just a one-time scan from a bot. Now it's much more intelligent scanning techniques that we're seeing. It's something lives here. Here's some follow-up calls to try to discover what lives here. Well, what third-party libraries are you using? Let me send specific traffic patterns to see if you're running WordPress or Drupal or whatever, and figure out what version of it is and see what common exploits we know about against that software stack. So that is something that has really gotten much more sophisticated and much more real time in the last 5 years. So that's something I would say to any organization out there. The other thing that I would say is, we've seen the rise of kind of frankly, the cybercrime business models. So for things like extracting data, extorting ransom, exposing, dumping data, and even filing SEC reports against organizations that have been breached to bring them into regulatory compliance issues, right? So that has really accelerated in the past 5 years, this kind of ecosystem, criminal ecosystem, if you will. The other thing that I would say is data has become more valuable. So many organizations have gone through whether it was pandemic fueled or not, but they've gone through a digital transformation and they've become software/digital companies, digital/data companies. So they're collecting more data than ever before. And that data can now be used in much more places. Things like identity theft, things like credential stuffings, things like just, dark marketplaces to sell this data off to whoever wants to pay for it. All of that has really accelerated in the last 5 years.
Okay, let's dive into a few of these points in more detail. Maybe a good starting point would be AI and automation. I mean, we've already had, going back 5 years, probably longer, significant automation.
Yeah.
Cyber criminals in the past couple of years now have generative AI, which maybe for phishing in particular, opened up a whole, new window of opportunity for very targeted kind of phishing campaigns.
Yep.
To what extent does that also extend? I mean, maybe it's automating coding and programming and so forth, but what impact does that have on other types of cybercrime?
Well, you certainly hit one of the nails on the head, which is automated programming, right? So nowadays you can think about, I'll use the example of APIs because that's what we deal with and that's what I'm most familiar with, but an API typically will have some documentation around it that describes it. It'll say, hey, there is this API, here's how you use it, etc. You can take that, give it to an LLM, and tell it to generate valid or properly formatted API requests, and you can have those in a matter of seconds. And then you can tell it to generate millions of requests for that API. And you can tell it to use a dictionary of improperly formatted requests and send those instead in order to try to an injection attack or cross-site scripting or something called server-side request forwarding, SSRF. All of these things they're doable in a matter of minutes nowadays because of the rise of, and frankly, how good generative AI is at writing code. All of the LLMs are trained on large scale open source code bases. So you can just scan GitHub, for instance, and the open source code libraries there and use that as a training model for your LLM. And now your LLM knows what good code looks like. And it can generate it so much faster than you or I can. And really, without having to learn or study or read the documentation, because it can do that for you in a matter of seconds. So that's one thing that has really, really accelerated.
Okay, so basically in the past, cyber criminals had to put some effort. They had an OpEx, right? They had to actually put some cost into this. And that meant they had to be quite targeted in terms of how they spent their time. And now they can just take a shotgun approach. What does that mean if you look at the proportion, maybe the ratios of where those efforts are going into? Are you seeing certain types of attacks kind of explode because AI makes them significantly more viable, whereas other ones, maybe for whatever reason, there's still some kind of OpEx bottleneck that makes them less viable at scale?
Well, definitely phishing attacks are on the rise. And maybe on the rise is not quite the right way to think about it, but they've not gone down any. And if you think about kind of just the spray and pray approach, as you mentioned, this kind of shotgun approach, just the raw numbers are going up around them, right? So more and more organizations are getting phishing emails as opposed to, again, in the past where the OpEx was higher. Now it is much, much lower. And the quality of the phishing emails is going up a lot, right? So that's one area where I would say it's gotten worse, if not just maintained. The other types of attacks that we see kind of going up right now are kind of novel attacks. And what I mean by that is, in the past, let's say in the last 10 years, there was a lot of just kind of like automation-driven scanning looking for low-hanging fruit, which was usually the form of things like things that were just kind of accidentally publicly exposed. I don't know if you tracked much, but let's say like 9-10 years ago, there was a very common problem of the open S3 bucket on Amazon Web Services. And what it is it's just basically think of it as like a file folder in the cloud. And a lot of times companies would either intentionally or unintentionally leave them wide open. And so anybody who happened to discover them could just go and pick up that data. Very low effort other than scanning. So the scanning was the OpEx, the scanning was the effort to find these things. Nowadays, what we see is that has actually decreased because the cloud providers have gotten better at applying secure default controls against those infrastructure resources. But on the other hand, things that have minimal security are getting attacked more frequently because it's very easy to tell an AI, oh, well, if you find a thing of type X, please try Y, and it might just unlock the door for you. So things with like a simple one factor or things with like a simple, just use a simple password to gain access to a set of files or something like that, that's going up as well. And then, of course, like, ransomware has been, the scale of ransomware attacks has gotten much, much more, I would say, both sophisticated and costly.
Yeah, I'm curious in your perspective on this kind of cloud. I'm here in Shanghai, as I mentioned earlier, and in China, people like on-premise. They just don't trust moving their data to the cloud. And then you look at that and you say, well, I would assume that Microsoft is going to be actually much better at securing your data than your IT team of 7 people.
Yeah.
I guess moving the data to the cloud out of the factory, okay, maybe there's a vulnerability in the movement there. But if you look at that situation and you say, okay, when does it make sense to migrate data to the cloud? When does it make sense to try to keep it on-prem? And then I guess you can look at that from an on-prem server situation, and then you have your whole IoT device, which is a bit of a separate thing. Right? That has to be kind of on the ground. But how do you analyze those different scenarios?
I've been a big believer in the cloud, and I've, as somebody who full disclosure, worked at one of the big three cloud providers for some time period and has spent a lot of time in the cloud ecosystem. I kind of have the same opinion as you, which is that generally speaking, the cloud providers are going to be much better at physical data center security than you are going to be. And they're going to be better at default network security than you're going to be on your own. The difference, though, is that when it comes to moving to the cloud, you actually have to think about the security model differently. If you think about on-prem, you're going to have kind of two layers of security. You're going to have kind of your physical security, so that who has access to the server room, who has access to the data center. And you can think about access cards and biometrics and key codes and all kinds of stuff that you can put on that side of it. But then you're actually left with a network. What I see time and again from companies that stay on-prem is that network is where they tend to apply all of their security efforts. They're just like, hey, I own this data center. As long as I keep bad actors out using firewalls, intrusion detection systems, what have you, I'm secure. And that is how most organizations operate in on-prem. Don't get me wrong, there are some that are more sophisticated and they'll actually do things like apply real zero trust models and have good user identity security and whatnot, but they're in the minority. What's different, though, when you shift to the cloud is that concept of the network perimeter kind of goes away. And there's an example that I like to use for people, and I know it's going a little bit deep, but on a cloud provider, I can actually take a backup of one single server, and with one little configuration change, I can make that backup publicly available. In order to do that on-prem, it's like 5 layers deep in the network topology, and I'd have to open up hole after hole after hole through firewalls and network access control lists in order to gain access to it. But my point in giving that example is to illustrate that concept of network perimeter security is kind of either gone or it's just very different. But what is there is a whole set of software controls and logical controls that can make your cloud environment 10 times more secure than your on-prem. The problem is it's apples and oranges, and most organizations don't understand that. So when they make the shift to the cloud, if they only understand the kind of the apples model of working, they often get it wrong in their first pass at migrating to the cloud. Where cloud actually makes things much better is that everything is software defined. What that means is that everything can be queried and everything can be automated. That also applies to your security controls. You can write scripts that automatically apply baseline security to everything in your cloud environment, or then tweak and tune advanced security settings across your entire environment. And then you can write software-defined and software-enforced policies that prevent you from stepping out of line and accidentally making mistakes and so on. And there's any number of tools providers that can really make that very easy for you and very easy for any human to understand and digest, including, by the way, multiple open source options that make that free. I stand on the side of cloud can be much more secure, but you need to understand the differences in the security models. And that is where I think the effort goes, or the effort is required, that is often missed.
Gotcha.
If you're still listening, then you must take technology seriously. So I'd like to introduce you to our case study database. Think of it as a roadmap that can help you understand which use cases and technologies are being deployed in the world today. We have cataloged more than 9,000 case studies and are adding 500 per month with detailed tagging by industry and function. Our goal is to help you make better investment decisions that are backed by data. Check it out at the link below, and please share your thoughts. We'd love to hear how we can improve it. Thank you, and back to the show.
And then you have this other element, which is edge devices, right? Where the data, might be migrated to the cloud, it might be migrated to a server, but it's also to some extent going to sit on a device somewhere in the world that has relatively little compute. So how do you think about the alternatives for how to secure those devices?
Look, edge is actually one of the most challenging things in the sense that it's not a fully blown cloud platform that has all of the kind of software controls that we just talked about. And to your point, it's also usually a thing that kind of needs to be somewhat open in order to be useful. And what that means is that actually the burden of security shifts to the design of the service that you're running at the edge. Usually an edge service is a piece of software. There may be some that are kind of hybrid hardware software solutions for various specific use cases, like let's say 5G telecommunications, where there's some specialized 5G hardware in play or something like that. But 9 times out of 10, what you do have control over is the software stack in there. And so that really means that what you have to look at from an edge perspective is how secure is the design of the software service that I'm running in the edge location. And that's, again, something that a lot of organizations with more traditional mindsets around security aren't going to fully understand or appreciate. What are the subtleties? What are the specific risks around the design of the software stack there?
Gotcha. So let's look at this from a different perspective, which is the perspective of who your adversary is. And I guess my impulse is that there's three types, right? There's the cyber criminal who's trying to make money. There's the enterprise who's trying to steal some kind of IP or know-how. And then there's the state, which might be trying to steal IP, might be, if it's Korea, North Korea might be trying to make money, or might have some other strategic objective. Does it make sense for an organization to put much thought into trying to anticipate who are my potential adversaries and then to take different defensive stances against them? Or do you basically just take this, kind of a similar set of strategies and assume that that's going to be the best fit across whatever adversary might be looking in your direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to give you kind of two answers. One is that, we talked a little while ago about how 20 years ago, only 10% of organizations needed to worry about cybersecurity. I would say this is maybe a case where maybe 10% of organizations need to worry about potential, let's say, enterprise espionage or nation state attacks. And those 10% are really, kind of the top 10%. That doesn't necessarily mean they're the top 10% in terms of size, but they're probably the top 10% in terms of the value of the sensitive data that they hold. That could be intellectual property. That could be things like, certainly an organization like OpenAI would fall into that top 10%. They don't have the scale of, let's say, an Amazon.com or the valuable data of a healthcare provider. But they've got this core piece of intellectual property that nation states all around the world would love to get their hands on, right? So think about if you find yourself falling into that top 10%, where you've either got super valuable data or you've got super valuable intellectual property, or you've got just the scale of having mass amounts of records, that's where you maybe need to think about protecting yourself from an enterprise attack or from a nation state attack. And the other one is, this is an analogy I'm going to borrow from a good friend of mine, Anthony Johnson, who actually shared it with me on the Modern Cyber podcast. So a little bit of a plug there. If you want to get the full detail on Anthony's telling, which is going to be better than mine, check out that episode. But he talks about kind of four personas. So you have Joey, Joe, Joseph, and Yusuf, right? And they're four versions of the same name. So who is Joey? Joey's a 13-year-old kid, classically, hanging out, playing video games in his mom's basement, and he gets access to some open source scripting stuff, and he's just poking around for fun, And then there's Joe, who is the early 20s version of Joey, and he's an early career professional working at an organization, and he has access now to a little bit more sophisticated tooling, and he starts to have a basic understanding of how organizations work, and he knows a little bit more about specifics of how to attack organizations. And then you have Joseph, and Joseph is kind of a 30-something or 40-something, mid-career professional with 15 to 20 years experience working for a nation state. And then you have Yusuf, who is the classic, top-end hacker, nation state or criminal underground employed. As an organization, if you're thinking about defending yourself, you better be ready for Joey, right? There's no excuse to get popped by a Joey anymore. And in fact, even a Joe who's got basic understanding, if you're not covering your basics, you're probably an irresponsible organization. Where it gets more kind of nuanced is in those top two personas, the Joseph and the Yusuf. If it's the Joseph who's kind of, mid-career, not super skilled, but has a 1 degree higher level of sophistication than Joe, then you need to ask yourself, what type of organization are we? How serious do we need to be? And by the way, are we capable of running it ourselves, or are we better off outsourcing this to a third-party provider? And this is actually one really positive development on the cybersecurity side, is that you have a real rise in what's called managed security services providers, MSSPs, or managed detection and response, MDR providers. And they're very good at what they do. Many of them are very good at what they do. And so if you're worried about Joseph, you have to ask yourself, do we feel like we're covered, or do we feel like we should outsource it? And if you're worried about Yusuf, maybe you're never going to be able to defend against Yusuf. Or maybe you're in that top 10% where you really need to worry about it. And in that case, you better have a very healthy budget and a very healthy, well-managed team.
Gotcha. Okay, so that Joseph one would be potentially like a hospital, right? I think a lot of hospitals probably 10 years ago weren't too worried about it. They had their IT team, it was competent.
Yeah.
But now people look at them and it's a nice fat target. We're like, I could probably get $10 million out of this hospital if I just shut down some of their critical services. And then I guess at the top level, it's I suppose there it's more like risk mitigation. If they really want to get in, they can probably get in, but it's kind of like,
that's right.
How quickly can you discover them? Can you limit access to certain data and so forth?
In the Yusufs of the world, these are the ones who are funded and have resources behind them. And they have time and they have specific targets, right? These are the ones who are really going after the top targets, and they're going to go after them again and again and again and again. And so to your point, if they really, really, really want to get in, they're dedicated and they've got the funding and the resources behind them to back them, they're going to find a way in. You look at all of the kind of very, very sophisticated attacks, and you can see that they have resources behind them.
Let's then turn to the topic of what's coming in the future, because I think this is a bit of a unique technology domain where most technologies, if you look at robotics or whatever, a company can look at it and say, maybe we should invest in robotics. We could get an operational efficiency. But you know what? If we don't invest right now, if we invest in 5 years or 10 years, we're probably not going to go bankrupt, right? We might lose a bit of competitiveness, but it's a decision you can make. But in this area, you have a set of companies that are going to be investing in the next generation, right? The cyber criminals will be investing. And so your hand is kind of forced. You at least, that the environment is going to change around you. And so if we look forward, maybe again, kind of 5-10 years into the future, what are the big changes in terms of the environment that you're expecting to see?
Well, I think one of them is exactly what you said, which is that, going forward for the next 5 years, kind of everybody is forced to make some investment in cybersecurity. But I will say again, for many organizations, the investment that they should make isn't going to be buying a lot of tools or hiring a lot of people. It's actually going to be outsourcing the problem. And being realistic about that and understanding your organization is going to be a positive way for you to make that decision in a rational manner and make the right decision. I will say one thing on the mindset of organizations as they think about making that decision. I very often hear about the so-called cybersecurity tax, and I really hate that term, and I'll share with you why. Taxes are things that you have to pay, but you hate. And you very often feel like your best approach is to try to minimize the amount that you can pay. And to even, we've seen organizations again and again use quote unquote creative accounting to get around paying the right amount of tax. And they play all these games and they move things offshore and they look for tax shelters and havens and all of these types of things. And you do it because you have to, but you're always trying to cheat the game. That's not going to be a great approach in cybersecurity. Right. Eventually, given the nature of the tools that the adversaries have in terms of cloud and scanning and automation and open source and AI, that will catch up to you. So please don't think of cybersecurity as a tax. All right. So those are just a couple of things. Your hand is going to be forced. You need to do something. The right thing might be to outsource, and please don't think of it as a tax. But now let's think about the specific threat domains that are coming. Look, I think there's a couple things that are coming. AI is coming, and it is coming hard and fast. And I'd say way faster than most people expected. And AI is actually a kind of interesting decision point for a lot of organizations because now they are faced with, again, a decision that they might have faced over the last 5 years, which is, let's say like for the last 5 years, they might have said, hey, are we going to stay on-prem or are we going to move to the cloud? Maybe it's the last 10 years they've been thinking about that. But now they have to think about that same thing with AI. Are we going to embrace it? Are we going to embrace it now? If we do it, are we going to try to do it in-house or are we going to work with a third-party provider? They're going to have to go through that set of decisions again. And I think the right decision for most organizations, there are very few organizations that have the scale, the volume of data, the infrastructure resources and the sophistication to run this in-house. And so the right decision for most organizations is you have to do it, but you're going to want to do it through a third-party provider. And you're going to want to do it by partnering with an OpenAI or with an Amazon or with a Google or a Microsoft or whoever it is that you end up deciding to work with, Anthropic, Claude, Cohere, whatever. When you go through that decision, you have to figure out how you're going to collaborate with that provider. And 9 times out of 10, it's going to be APIs. And it's going to be writing code on your side that communicates with that AI provider and figuring out how you send relevant data to them, how you structure your queries, and how you get relevant data back and then utilize it. So that's going to open up a wave of API utilization, both creation and consumption. And that is something that I'm really, really concerned about because most organizations don't understand what the risks are. And similarly, you brought up robotics, and I think it's actually while specific robots may not be the right solution for many things, any organization that has anything to do with any kind of hardware device, IoT is the way that I think about it, right? Internet of Things. And that thing could be anything from a connected car to a home security camera to the doorbell that I have at my front door, right? To see who's there. All of those things are also talking over APIs. So we just see this flood of APIs coming over the next several years. And the risks around them are poorly understood, and most organizations aren't looking at them yet. And I think there are real, tangible, near-term risks and threats against the success of these programs and their implementations that people should be aware of. Number one is, from the standpoint of AI, one of the main things that you have to do is actually build up models and continue to feed them. There is an attack vector called data poisoning. And what that means is if I find an open access point on your network where you are ingesting data for the purposes of training an AI model, and I find that I can actually feed that data, first of all, it's very easy for me to find that through scanning. Second of all, it's usually very easy for me to understand the structure of what the API expects and what kind of data I can send there. And I can send all kinds of data that will just throw off your models and make your AI efforts way less successful. It'll just completely throw your model off, right? Now, that takes time and effort. And if you're monitoring for it, great. But if you're not, that's a real risk. Second is, time and again, we see organizations that create APIs that are designed for one purpose, maybe receiving data, but accidentally expose other functions like extracting data as well. And typically when we see that, we also see that they don't have good protections or permission systems on them. So that's another very tangible threat that I'm worried about for organizations over the next few years.
Okay, so I like the way that you frame this. I mean, it's very simple, but you've got AI exploding in terms of usage. Yep. You also have IoT exploding in terms of the number of connected devices. You just walked us through the logic of some of the steps that you can take to address AI. Is it a similar set of steps or activities that you would take to defend yourself if you're planning large IoT deployments, or are you going to have different defensive mechanisms there?
No, it's basically the same. And all the time, by the way, it always starts with visibility and understanding what APIs you have and what APIs you're consuming. And for many organizations, actually, they don't have that. We recently talked to an automobile manufacturer who will remain nameless. They're working on a software-driven car, basically, like many of the manufacturers are, right? You know, self-driving vehicle technology. In that, we asked them to describe all of the communications that the vehicle has with the backend cloud services that they're using to kind of feed it, train it, monitor it, et cetera. And we just asked the simple question, well, how many APIs are running on either side? Server side, how many APIs is the car talking to? Car side, how many APIs does the car actually have? You know, the car actually has kind of a server infrastructure of its own that is receiving data from the cloud as well. And they laughed at me. And I said, what's funny? And they're like, we have no idea. Just like no idea how many APIs are running either side. And I said, well, why? And then we kind of got into it. And it's the same pattern that we see again and again. You have software developers who are told to make something happen. And very often, the security and the teams responsible for monitoring are out of that loop. And the developers are told, you know, get it done. And they're very often given unrealistic and super tight deadlines because it's a very competitive space and it's a race to be the first to really bring this to mass scale globally, right? Because the opportunity is massive. And so in that regard, you have this kind of misaligned incentives between what the security team is responsible for and what the development team is responsible for. The development team is told, get it done. The security team is left to kind of chase behind them and understand what's going on. And so whether it's AI, whether it's IoT, connected cars, what have you, you always have to start with that visibility. And it's the same approach either side. If you have an understanding of what's there, then you can actually start the next step of the process, which is to assess all of those connection points and understand the specific vulnerabilities of each of them. When you have that understanding, then you can look at what are we going to do? Are we going to try to lock it down with network security controls? Are we going to try to, apply a stronger handshake protocol? Or do we need to go back to the developers and say, actually, you've got to fix the design of this thing because there are flaws in it that really have to be addressed and can only be addressed on the software side. So you've got kind of multiple options, but it starts with having that kind of visibility picture and assessment of what's out there to know where the risks lie. And that's the same across either side, AI or IoT.
Gotcha. Just one final question, just in case there's any lawyers that made it to the end of the podcast here. I believe I heard, I might be misremembering this, but that whether it was Congress or an executive order, that there was some legislation that actually kind of put legal liability around cybersecurity, and like the IoT companies, have to have some kind of defense. Certainly with connected vehicles, my understanding is that fully autonomous vehicles, there would be a kind of an expectation of liability for the OEM.
Yeah.
But then you get into this situation where let's say there's a tier one supplier that's supplying components to the OEM, and they kind of built the API, and then there's the OEM, and then there's maybe Hertz is the rented car which owns the fleet, and then there's the driver. And so where does the liability lie in these circumstances?
Oh, it's such a good question, but it is one that is so hard to answer right now. You've got a number of things in play here. So first, you've got a mandate that, at least here in the US, came out from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, the Secure by Design mandate. It's about a year old, by the way, right now. The problem is it didn't have any specific kind of consequences to it, nor did it have specific assignments for who actually owns the security or the secure design, right? Second, you have the SEC, which is now requiring material breach event filings and notifications. And so if you look at it from either perspective, you can look at it from the CISA side, which is to say, well, okay, you've got the tier one manufacturer, and then you've got these OEM providers. I don't know who's responsible. And it's not clear in the mandate yet. And by the way, there hasn't been any kind of, case precedent law to really nail that down just yet. We're seeing our first prosecutions on cybersecurity liability right now, and all of those are taking way longer than expected. And arguably, by the way, are mistargeted, but that's a separate topic that we don't really have time for today. And then you've got the SEC mandate, which is also super vague. It's, you don't have to tell us about your design. You don't have to tell us about how good you are at, let's say, vulnerability management, but you have to tell us when you've had a material breach. What defines material? And, for a while, there was even uncertainty around the time period. And I would say there's maybe even still uncertainty around the time period. I think it's 96 hours right now, 4 days from the time of breach. But is it from the time the breach event happened? Or is it from the time that you learned about it? Is it from the time that there was, let's say, the first data for sale on the dark web? All of that is still unclear. So if I'm a lawyer and I'm looking at the space, you kind of have to monitor both sides. You're going to have to monitor the case law and the precedent set by the courts a lot. It's still super unclear in my mind. And by the way, I've talked to a lot of people off the record, and they are super scared. And I mean specifically the people in like senior security leadership positions, particularly with publicly traded companies, the ones who fall under the SEC regulations, right? They are confused and they're scared. And they don't know whether they're going to have to be personally liable for things going forward, whether there's going to be, a lot of people talked about some of those filings as the Sarbanes-Oxley moment for cybersecurity, where, in the aftermath of the Enron financial scandal, Sarbanes-Oxley came into account, and CEOs and CFOs have to sign off on financial statements now, right? CEOs and CFOs of publicly traded companies. Well, is that coming for security professionals as well? that they're going to have to sign off on the security posture or the security programs that their organizations have. Nobody is sure. Ton of uncertainty, a lot of fear, a lot of confusion right now, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully we work through this. Yeah, I know here in China, the rumor is that a lot of the OEMs have kind of L3 automation capability built into their vehicles, but they don't want to activate it because then they become legally liable when a car is in that state. So they call it like 2.5, and consumers kind of understand that it's L3, but we're not going to call it that to avoid liability. Let's see. This will have to work its way out. Jeremy, this has been, for me, a fascinating conversation. Is there anything that we missed that's really important for folks to understand?
There's nothing major that we missed. I think we've covered a broad range of things around AI and IoT, and I hope it's been a useful conversation. The only thing I would say for anybody who's interested in learning more, please do have a read of our State of API Security Report 2024. It's free. You can download it off our website. If you have any questions afterwards, please just reach out to us. We're more than happy to help.
And that's FireTail.io. Jeremy, thanks for joining me on the call.
My pleasure, Eric. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. If you have unique insight or a project deployment story to share, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. Write us at eric.walenza@iot1.com.